The podcast.
Thanks, Tor. Lovely to be back.
It's been 5 years, hasn't it?
I believe it has. I think we spoke at the
Wow.
beginning when I'd just launched Humanity Works Consultancy, and
And that's been
here we
five
are now.
years.
Yeah, yeah. Friends for
Wow.
five
Because
years.
friends for 5 years, because we met during COVID.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. Wow. So much. It's almost like 5 years later, did COVID even happen? Like
No.
that sometimes that feeling you're like, you have to remind yourself that for we were locked in our houses for 2 years.
Yeah. It's such a strange concept now, isn't it, to think about?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's also, it's, I suppose it's like the world just in so many ways bounced back to what it was before in a way. Not to say that that was quote unquote normal, which is what people were saying, get back to normal. But it's at least largely back to what it once was in so many ways. However, before we head into all of that, Sharon, who are you? And just tell me a bit about yourself and what you're getting up to these days.
So, I am the Chief Heart Officer at Humanity Works Consultancy. I think the job I was always meant to do, and the role I was always meant to play. As Michelle Obama says, we're always becoming, right? And
Mm,
I feel like I am becoming the person I was always meant to be through the work that I do, which is to help teams thrive in times of change, which has been an absolute kind of honor and a pleasure to work with all these high performing teams and helping them to work through the challenges that change brings and helping them
mm,
to kind of break down those silos and learn to work together as a unit and be really strong together. So
mm,
I absolutely love that because I fundamentally believe that we are better together.
mm,
And I think as a human being, you asked, who am I? I'm more than the title, right? I'm a human being,
mm,
and I'm someone who, and anyone that listened to the original podcast will know that story that I went through an incredibly challenging time. It's 10 years ago now, and I almost lost my life then. And that experience really changed me and shifted me from being a very command and control leader to being a more heart-centered leader. And through
mm,
that healing process and taking that time to really look at who I was and who I wanted to be, that really has changed me, even, my personal life as well. And it's been such a kind of period of reinvention over these last 10 years. And in that time, I've become a mum. I have two children now. I'm married, something that I didn't think was even possible when I was going through such a challenging time a decade ago.
mm,
And it's been incredible. Like when I look back as well, you were just speaking about the pandemic and how
mm,
that has changed us and how we've kind of all bounced back. But I think the pandemic was a collective trauma. And as somebody who
mm,
has gone through trauma, I know that you can never be the same again. There will always be a part of you that shifts, that changes. You can't ever really go back. These events, these moments, they shape us, they shift us, and they should do. And
mm,
we evolve and we adapt. And I think
mm,
that is the process I've gone through as well. I've gone through a process of learning and unlearning and learning again. And I think that foundation of always learning has really served me well, and it's allowed me to go through that process of reinvention. I think that's something that we all need more of, especially as the world is becoming more complex, it's becoming more changeable, it's becoming more challenging. And so having that ability to be able to adapt and flex is really crucial to building resilience. And I
mm.
encourage more people to go on that journey.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it's interesting that you used the word collective trauma there because the following thing I was going to say before I went into Sharon, introduce yourself, was to say, and I suppose in so many ways it was a collective trauma, which I don't know if we've ever actually recovered from. Like we might think we have, but actually sort of, I guess, in so many ways, lingering beneath the surface is that collective trauma, which you're absolutely right, that we will never sort of bounce back from. I think some people might think that they have, but I wonder how many people has actually gone on that healing, transformative journey that is possible after trauma, right? Because, I've gone through trauma, you've gone through trauma, and I suppose some people, for for one reason or another, gets worse from it, whilst others sort of rise from the ashes like a phoenix, right? Which in so many ways you did with your journey. And it's not to say that people who don't rise from the ashes like a phoenix is quote unquote doing anything wrong. It's just for some reason that's not happening for them yet, basically. You call yourself, even though of course we are human beings beyond our titles, but still, I think you're the only one I've ever seen, and maybe you have seen others, and that's where the inspiration comes from, but you call yourself a chief heart officer, and I love that. Tell us more about what does that mean to you?
Yeah, so I'm the second Chief Heart Officer. So the first one is Claude Silver at VaynerMedia. So Chief Heart Officer concept.
Ah,
Yeah, she's brilliant. You should
oh yes, and I
everyone
have
should
heard
follow
that
her.
actually. I
Yeah.
have heard that. That is true. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Great.
So Gary V, I mean,
Yeah.
this is really the inspiration is from Gary V, the entrepreneur. So he
Mm,
wants to create the most human workplace culture, the most human organization at VaynerMedia. And he
mm,
appointed Claude Silver as the chief heart officer. And when they created that role, there was no real job description for it. He said, I want you to personally touch every single person in this company with empathy
mm,
and connection, essentially. And that was the basis of that job when it started. And what Claude and Gary have created is something incredibly powerful. That's a company now that's grown from having just a few hundred employees to thousands of employees around the world. They
mm.
have like 97% retention rate. I mean, these are
Wow.
numbers that are completely unheard in organizations. And they have created, I think, not just it's not just a job, I think it's a movement. And
Mm,
Gary is somebody who I've listened to for years, and I think he can see the future. He can see things I think that other people don't see or maybe don't want to see. And I was listening to him recently speaking, and he said that he thinks that there will be more chief heart officers in organizations over the next 10 years, and that actually there's a huge shift back towards wanting more connection, more human connection,
mm,
wanting kind of more experiences.
mm,
There is an explosion on platforms like Etsy in people buying handcrafted items. We might be living in the world of artificial intelligence, but we've never needed human intelligence more. And actually,
mm,
that is, in many ways, as human beings, our biggest competitive advantage. And as a chief heart officer, I'm really part of that movement. And I bring chief heart officer services into organizations on a fractional basis. So I work with companies where they are going through some kind of transformation or some kind of shift. They want to improve the culture, they want to improve the output, they want to improve the resilience of their people. And as a chief heart officer, I come in as an advisor to the C-suite, working with them to help them understand, who are the rock stars in your team that don't show up on the dashboard? Everybody knows who the quote unquote superstars are, right? The people who are driving the big numbers in the organization. But what about the people who make everyone else around them better? How do they show up? How do we find those
mm,
people? When you're a CEO and you're running a small business, you instinctively know who all those people are. When you're scaling a business, how can you possibly know that when your company's shifting from
mm,
a couple of hundred employees up to a couple of thousand? You can't be in every conversation, you can't be in every room. But actually knowing who those people are, having somebody in the organization that can fundamentally understand who the people are, how they work well together, how to create a culture that is based on courage and connection, which are the fundamental aspects of actually creating true resilience. that is something a chief heart officer knows. And it's not somebody
Mm.
who sits in HR. HR is a different function. Actually, in VaynerMedia, for example, the chief heart officer sits above the HR function, sits alongside
Right.
the CRO, sits alongside the CEO. And that's very much the role I play in organizations on that fractional basis, where I will be working with the CEO. I will be feeding them information about the people that work in the organization, the shifts that are happening in their culture. How can we make that culture more connected? How can we help the teams to work together more strongly to be better units? And actually,
Right.
if you want to scale culture in an organization, if you want to scale performance, then teams are the way to scale it. It's actually not going through individual interventions. It's actually how can we make the team stronger because it's the units that will really drive that performance. And as a chief heart
Mm.
officer, not only do I fundamentally understand human behaviors, but I also bring 20 years of corporate knowledge, having worked as a senior
Yeah,
leader.
yeah.
So I blend both the coaching knowledge, the application of how to apply that within a cultural context in an organization, with all of the background of having worked in corporates for 20 years. So I understand the nuances, but I also understand how businesses work when they scale, because our client base is a mix between scaling businesses and the very large corporates.
Mm.
And like I said in the beginning, it's a privilege, and it's an absolute joy to be able to do this work.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with that anymore. It's like when I run my group sessions and everything, I just say to people like, it's just such a privilege and honor to be able to now have the opportunity to hold this space for other people. I mean, that's such a privilege and honor. And it's also such a big responsibility, right? Which needs to be done with tact, compassion, courage, connection, all of these things that you just said. And yeah, it's an interesting conversation about whether these things come naturally to human beings or whether it's something that we have to foster, or whether the opposite is true, whether sort of, I don't know, competitiveness, harshness, etc., is something that's been conditioned into us, whilst actually love, connection, courage is what comes natural. I don't know. That's an interesting conversation to have. It's and I do have a question which is kind of comes before that, which I think is an important distinction to make, right? Because and you sort of answered it in what you were just saying, but I enjoyed what you said about that. The chief heart officer does not sit within HR. We do need the HR department, but this is actually something that's different. And just for the listener, could you sort of elaborate on how the chief heart officer is different to like HR? Because that might be a distinction that some people might not be able to see immediately, basically. Because I instinctively understand, because obviously I have experience with HR, so I instinctively understand what the difference is. But Sharon, like, what is the difference there?
I think that HR, traditionally, the role is much more around kind of policies. It's about
Mm,
making sure that the business remains compliant when it comes to its people practices. It's about ensuring that the frameworks are put in place that govern how people will be working together. It's about, driving that kind of recruitment. So it's
mm,
fundamentally understanding and putting together those people policies and structures as is
yeah.
right, as is required, and is the law. And but I think, in addition to that, there is that element around the culture. And often the people practices get lumped into one, within the HR department.
Mm,
And I think it's really difficult for an HR team to be all of those things. I think
mm,
that specialism in understanding how to build a culture, who are the people within the organization that actually might need some special attention, might need some help, that needs to be done by a different individual to the person who's going to talk you through the contract. Or if you're the
mm,
person that's maybe being managed out of the business, that would typically be done by HR. It can't be the same person that goes in and then talks to people about what you might be struggling with. and being able to understand those things. I think that's asking a lot of one
Mm,
team, one department. And I think that separation actually is important. That's not to say that HR can't play a more nurturing role. Of course they can. I think, though, that the strength of the Chief Heart Officer really lies in fostering the culture of connection, of trust, of high performance. I call it high performance and high heart. I don't think that we are losing one over the other. I think there's always and perhaps a misunderstanding when we talk about things like courage and connection and trust, that these are seen as soft. But actually,
mm,
there's a huge return on investment in actually investing in building the fundamentals of what makes a very high performing team or a high performing organization. And while the
mm,
outcome is high performance, it's not about pushing people to the edge or about pushing people over the edge is what will allow you to get the high performance. It's actually there are elements that require us to be more of a collective unit to actually drive
mm,
that high performance. And once you understand the science behind that, that is really what will drive your business to succeed. It's not
mm,
about seeding any of the performance. You're actually going to be encouraging the performance. And when you do that, all the good things happen. Your best people will stay. You will therefore have continuity in your business. The engagement levels will be higher, the productivity will be higher, and the stress levels will be lower, which means people will be more resilient when things go wrong, which inevitably
mm,
they will do. And so it's so logical. It's almost hard to understand how people can't do this. But like you
mm,
say, we are holding on to a lot of old thinking, a lot of old models around command and control,
mm,
helicopter management, and all of these things, they inhibit people's ability to build trusting units of high connection that allow teams to be able to thrive. And
mm.
I think that chief heart officer role is really pivotal in not just understanding it, but in actually building the case for that return on investment.
Mm, right. Yeah. No, absolutely. When we originally spoke during COVID, well-being was on everybody's lips during those 2 years of COVID, right? Everybody was having yoga sessions, breathwork sessions, etc., and so on and so forth. At least in my experience, that has had a dip since, I would say, and maybe it's coming back with people like yourselves. But I'm curious about how have you sort of experienced, how has corporate well-being, I suppose, changed since the last time we talked, and like how is it continuously changing? Like, what are some of your thoughts around that?
I mean, the well-being industry is huge. It's like a $6.3 trillion industry,
Yeah.
bigger than like lots of countries' GDP, and it's still destined to grow. I mean, so it's huge in
Yeah.
of itself. I think that the industry has exploded in the last
Mm,
5 years, attaching well-being to something or wellness. I mean, we shouldn't use those terms interchangeably because they are different, but attaching that to products and services has been a way to, be on trend. And I think that the way that the market has exploded, it's really gone down the route of being very individualistic.
mm,
So it's a lot about how can the individual be fixed. Let's run lunch and learn sessions where we teach people to be more individually resilient. I think
mm,
we understand now from the research that was done, particularly in Bruce Daisley's book, Fortitude, that actually individual resilience sessions don't work.
mm,
Resilience is a team sport. It's not an individual trait. We don't become more resilient by becoming stronger within ourselves. We draw our strengths from the people around us. And I think that there's an enormous amount of wellness fatigue within organizations where you can't get the employees to come to the well-being or wellness sessions because they don't have enough time in their calendar to give over
Mm.
to attending a session. And so I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding around what actually creates well-beings. You know,
Mm.
we're talking about creating well-beings in organizations, right?
Mm.
Well, and the answer seems to be let's throw well-being at them. But it's an
Mm.
outcome of being in a culture in which you feel that you belong. It's an outcome of being in a culture where you feel valued, respected, and appreciated. It's the outcome of having working practices that allow you space for connection. In many ways, the reason why we're seeing such high levels of stress, such a kind of pandemic in another way, which is around loneliness and isolation, is because a lot of what's happened in organizations is we have prioritized productivity over connection. And
Mm.
so when you couple that with the trend of fixing individuals and being much more individualistic, that narrative of collectivism and that trust, that belonging, that connection has almost become sidelined. And as a result of it, we're seeing that despite there being a larger spend in that wellness industry, that
Mm.
isn't correlating or translating to people being feeling better. And
Mm.
much of the evidence suggests that if you want to create more well-being people within organizations,
Mm-hmm.
then actually reducing the number of hours or minutes people spend in meetings and clearing people's calendars is a more effective measure or more effective way of being able to do that. Having lunch together, for half an hour or a 1 hour lunch break where people break bread together is far more effective at actually creating connection and high performance in organizations. The Wellbeing Research Centre has shown that actually the biggest driver for well-being is belonging. So
Mm.
all of the evidence exists. These aren't new evidence points that I'm particularly bringing out. They have been in existence for years. The research is there. I think that a lot of the solutions that are on offer, while I'm not suggesting there's anything wrong with them, great. Learn to be more mindful, learn to meditate, learn to breathe well. All those things are great to do. I
Mm.
think it's too simplistic to think, though, that those in themselves will be the answer to creating organizations where we have high performance. What the
Mm.
working world has shifted fundamentally. And while we can think that in some ways on the outside that we have gone back to working like we used to, I don't believe we are. I think that
Mm.
we will never go back to working the way we used to. Actually, we need to imagine now new futures and think about how we can work with the world in which we operate in. I think one of the biggest issues that we have right now that is actually affecting people's well-being in the workplace, because we were talking about corporate well-being, is this: the mobile
Mm. The
phone,
phone, yeah.
the phone devices. And we are in a world now where our levels of distraction are so high that actually we need to create cultures that are what I call anti-distraction.
Mm.
And by that, I mean we need to be very intentional about how we create an oasis of focal points within the day where your people can come together, where they can connect, where they can do deeper focused work. Because if we don't create those
Mm.
pockets, then actually people will continue to have elevated stress levels. And it doesn't matter then how much mindfulness or meditation
Mm.
techniques you use. Fundamentally, you will not be able to get the work done as effectively, as efficiently as we need to.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I think, is a shift in the way that organizations need to think about how they really put in place well-being initiatives in their organizations. I think the shift needs to be, instead of throwing well-being at people, is stepping back and saying, what actually creates well-being
Mm,
for the organization, and not just thinking about how can we make each individual more resilient? How do we create that across an organization? You cannot scale it by making people stronger within themselves when the way that they derive their strength is through connection and is through belonging
hmm
and is through having cultures in which trust is fundamental.
mm. Yeah, it's interesting. Because I was then going to ask you, like, not to spill the beans on your secret sauce, of course, but let's say that you are working with an organization around creating trusting teams that connect and have courage and create space for deep work, and creating sort of team resilience. Like, what is an exercise or activity or approach or strategy? Like, how do you work with organizations to create that over doing a guided meditation session, for example, you know?
Yeah, so I think, kind of building that bridge between what we were just talking about, between
Yeah,
well-being and the team performance, it's really
yeah,
about integrating the practices within the team structure and within the team rituals. So they can't be add-ons, they need to become a part of how you operate together. So team
mm,
resilience is different to individual resilience.
mm-hmm,
In individual resilience, we talk a lot about the bounce back. You've gone through a
mm-hmm,
hard time, how do you bounce back?
mm,
I don't love that definition because I think it makes people feel like they have to rush to suddenly be okay when they go through something difficult. And
mm,
resilience is fundamentally about being human. I call it sitting in the messy middle because
mm,
that's where we spend most of our life, in that gray
yeah,
area. And I think that we want to think, if I am harder on myself and if I'm harder on other people, that they will get stronger. But that's not the way that it works. While the output might look like that you are stronger, the inputs are actually a lot softer, like showing yourself compassion, like reaching out to someone when you're having a hard time, like being able to share that level of vulnerability, asking for help, working with others to be able to solve challenges rather than taking them on yourself. In an
mm,
individualistic society, we really hero worship the superwoman or the superman or the
mm,
superperson.
mm,
But that doesn't work in a complex and ever-changing world. And actually, resilient teams and the definition of a resilient team is actually about how do we adapt, how do we flex, how do we learn and grow together. That is the difference. And the highest performing teams really operate in what I call three kind of buckets. So the formula that we've devised is called mindset, skill set, and tool set. The mindset that I have seen the most resilient teams employ is something called gritty optimism. The
mm-hmm,
skill sets that they all have is how do they adapt and flex together and make strategic decisions quickly together without pivoting too quickly. That's the key skill that they have. And then the cultural tool set is how do they build that trust and that psychological safety so that when things are going wrong or they're encountering challenging times, they can lean on each other to work through it together. Three kind of key tools that I think really help to bring this to life is for the gritty optimism piece, so that mindset piece. The first thing I would recommend is actually a tool from the US Army. It's called Embrace
mm,
the Suck. And
mm,
what that and I think it really builds on kind of Dr. Susan David's work around emotional agility. Because to build gritty optimism is to say that I've recognized that something is hard at the moment and I can move forward through it.
Mm.
So there was an interesting kind of story from an admiral, James Stockdale, and he was a prisoner of war in Vietnam. And he talked about his time in the camps. And he said that the people who struggled the most were actually the relentless optimists. And the reason why they struggled the most was because they thought that they would, they could just be optimistic and everything would be okay. So they'd be the people saying, I think we'll be out by Christmas. We'll definitely be out by next Easter. We'll definitely be out by the following year. And he said the reason why they struggled is they never really leaned into the challenge of the situation they were in. And he said what's actually required is the ability to be able to understand that you're in a very challenging situation and call that out and have the belief that you will prevail. And this
Mm.
tool from the US Army called Embrace the Suck is actually teaches us to be able to do that. And what it does is it says, okay, name the suckiness of a situation. Yeah, that's totally a word I haven't just made up. And then work through, what you're learning from the situation. So if I was to put that into a workplace context to kind of bring this to life, let's say, your manager is constantly changing the goalposts because everything's changing in your organization. You might say to yourself, okay, it's making me feel really stressed and really worried because my manager keeps changing the goalposts. So you're naming the suck. And it's teaching me how to ask better strategic questions. It's teaching me patience. And by doing that, you're recognizing that actually there's a path forward. You're learning through it. So that's your optimism. But at the same time, you're not denying your feelings that actually this is causing you a lot of stress and a lot of anxiety. And I think so much of what we really need to get to grips with is actually managing tensions of things that feel like polar opposites. They're called polarities. And
Mm.
that is much of what is happening right now in organizations. And so, where you can foster that mindset in a team, in a group unit, that allows you all to be able to acknowledge challenging times and be able to push forward. It develops accountability, it fosters agency. And where you are navigating challenging times and you're working under pressure, that's fundamental in a team unit. And then that way, everybody understands the mindset that they're working towards. The skill set, a really good tool for the skill set, which is around developing more flex, developing more adaptable systems. There's probably a couple that I could mention here. One is the OODA framework, again from the Army. It stands for Observe, Orient, Decide, and Act. So let's say the CEO has come to you and said, I think we should automate our entire team and do away with people and actually use AI. Panic. Okay, what are we going to do here? Okay, well, he's asking a genuine question. What he's really asking is actually, how do we deliver more efficiencies, right? So what do we do then? Okay, well, OODA then is a great framework for you to work through because you say, okay, what is the situation we're dealing with? What do we observe? What is it, the data that we need to pull in that's informing this decision, around, changing the makeup of the team, technology, humans? What do we then need to shift to? Is it as extreme? So this is the orient bit. Is it as extreme as actually, getting rid of the entire team? Is there a third way in between this, the gray area, which is no doubt the preferred option? Decide what are we going to do then? What are the different capabilities we need in the team? How do we shift that? What do we do here? And then the act. What do we do? How do we act now? That allows you to, instead of burying your head in the sand and being afraid because the CEO's come in with something and being like, well, I'm not going to get involved in that, or making a knee-jerk reaction and pivoting so quickly that actually you're going to ruin the business model anyway. The OODA gives you a framework that you can work in an agile and flexible manner while actually putting in some real thought into this. There are one-way decisions and there are two-way decisions, two-door decisions, right? The one-way decisions are the irreversible ones, right? If you entirely change the makeup of the team, that's pretty irreversible for quite a long time, I
Mm,
would say. But then there are decisions that are quite quick that can be made. And actually, they're the kind of two-door ones, and we don't need to debate them ad nauseum. And as team units, developing that skill and that ability to recognize what those are and how we can work through them quicker is an incredible flex because in an ever-changing environment, clarity is everything. If you're the
mm,
team that can bring clarity in an ever-changing environment, that allows you to grow and grow stronger together. And then the final one is that cultural tool set. So how do we build that connection? How do we build that trust? One of the best tools I've come across for this is the Fail Fika from Spotify. You might know this because of
because of my
your
heritage.
Nordic
Unfortunately,
connection.
fika is Swedish, but I can obviously understand. I can think I can guess. I think I can guess.
Yeah. So here what we're looking for is how do we, and I talked about this at the top as well, how do we integrate the well-being rituals into the way the team works? Now, often
Mm,
we think about well-being as, again, as something that we need to do to ourselves, but actually, how can we make it okay for people to acknowledge failings and mistakes and be able to move through them because that is fundamentally what builds trust. I think a lot of what we see trust as is almost like and psychological safety is moving away from hard things or denying the hard realities. But actually, that's not what builds trust. It's about working through the hard things together. So instead of blaming and shaming
mm,
each other, how do we come together? And the fail fika is a great tool for that because fika in Swedish means to have coffee and cake. And in Spotify, at the end of a project cycle, they host a fail fika, which is where everybody that was involved in the project comes together and they talk about the failings of that project. And they do that over coffee and cake because, everything's better over
mm.
coffee and cake, right? But what they're
Everything.
doing is yeah, I love it as well. They're normalizing failings. They're normalizing talking about making mistakes. They're creating psychological safety in the team. They're allowing that team unit to actually build trust and to say, we're going to have an adult to adult conversation here about what went wrong, what we learned from it, and how we move forward and what we might do differently next time. Having psychological safety is not the absence of hard things, it's working through the hard things. It's actually leaning into that discomfort. And I think the Fail Fika does a great job of doing that and allowing teams to be able to work through that. And
Mm,
for me, those three items that I've just described to you, they're the biggest flexes that you can make as a team unit right now to build that resilience.
mm. I love that. I love how specific and down to earth and practical all of those tips were. And I think that's something that everybody who's just listened to can like go away and perhaps even try out with their teams. And I think especially something that stood out towards the end, which I think it's that failed fika, which is that it creates a space, a framework where it's okay to talk about your failings, right? It creates a container where it's okay to do that and you won't become, or it's about learning from it, not get reprimanded, which of course is a part of the fear, right? Is that if you fail, you can get fired or you won't get that bonus or whatever. So it's like creates a kind of reinforcing machine where you don't talk about it because you're afraid of the outcomes, basically. Leading up to today's conversation, you sent me a really fascinating article which talks about sort of the trends
Yeah.
amongst the generation that is perhaps younger than myself, I guess, even, but I think it's probably just a part of culture in general where, it's so fascinating. Everything that we've been talking about today is how can we become more sort of collectivistic and have more collectivism. And I remember reading this book when I was doing a master's in social innovation about collectivism and individualism and how Western, especially at least Scandi countries in many ways are like quite incredibly individualistic in a way. It's a weird one. So we are seeing a trend towards more individualism, whilst what we need is more collectivism. And so, of course, what you have just spoken about would make huge strides towards creating more collectivism. However, the evidence is showing that we are moving in this opposite direction. Like, what are your thoughts there? And also, of course, with the age of AI upon us, and it's interesting. You were also talking about leadership, and of course, the biggest leader on the planet right now is Donald Trump, right? Which is command, conquer. It's all about me. It certainly doesn't seem that it's about creating well-being and so on and so forth. So we also, I mean, of course, someone like Gary Vee is somebody who is a role model for what it might look like to create a culture which is more collectivistic, right? These role models do exist, but in the highest offices of the earth, we have people who are, at least to me, you might disagree, seemingly the opposite to that. Like, what are your, I know I've just thrown lots of different thoughts at you, but what are your thoughts and how do we work towards changing this?
Yeah. I think Donald Trump's a really interesting case in point, isn't he? Because there are many elements of him that are that command and control leadership
Mm,
style. And at the same time, he does speak a lot about community and the need to have a strong team around him. And he speaks a lot about loyalty.
mm,
And he is someone who, in many ways, talks about kind of going back to an older time where
mm,
almost life was simpler. So I think that there's an interesting paradox there, that there
mm,
are actually elements that he speaks about, which are about how he works and how he leans heavily on the people around him, which actually is in some ways quite collectivist. The
I guess so, yeah.
movement, yeah, the movement that he's created around him is actually a community. You might not like it, you might not want to be a part of that community, or you might not identify with that ideology,
Mm,
but actually they're exhibiting all the traits of the strength that comes from unity. And
mm,
and in many ways, I think explains his rise and the
mm,
power of his base and part of the reason why they're getting stronger. So I think that in a weird way, and this might sound strange coming from a chief heart officer, there's actually a lot that could be learned from that
mm,
approach. I'm not suggesting that if you don't agree with his ideology, and lots of people do, but if you don't, I think if you look past the ideology and you look at the
mm,
way that they have scaled their message, the community that they've built around them, actually they have created a sense of belonging. And in
mm.
that community, they do have incredible trust in Donald Trump. And
Yeah.
he has really, he's fostered that. And
Mm,
of course, it's come at a cost because
mm,
it's come at the exclusion of other communities. And of course, there is then a trade-off and a price to be paid. But within itself, the structure that he is creating in many ways is actually borrowing some of the things that we've just talked about. And so I don't think it's as clear cut as
mm,
what is happening there is all bad. And we need to look for other role models like Gary Vee. I think Gary Vee is someone who's very ahead of his time, like I said,
mm,
and I think that and the way that he sees the world, he kind of plays things with the long-term goals. And that's the way he also runs his business. I've heard other people from his organization talk about, the fact that they do free work for clients because they're thinking about the long-term relationship. And that isn't necessarily how a lot of organizations work. I think, particularly for organizations which are, say, VC backed, have all these kind of serious funding that they do, to create that very human workplace culture would be much harder because you're
mm,
essentially working to deliver the returns on the business for the investment. And so therefore that does engender a lot of short-termism. So I think, we have to,
Mm.
I think everything in organizations is about context. You've got to understand the context within which you're operating in to understand which model is going to fit really well. So an organization that I know does this really well, that is a very large corporate, is Cisco. So they're a
Okay.
huge tech provider, and they have social connection as one of the core pillars of their well-being strategy. They actually are on a mission to deliver high performance in a human-centered way. They're actually an organization that I have just started working with and actually be delivering a talk for them
Mm.
quite soon. And you can feel that in
Right.
every layer of the organization that they whether it's, the chief product officer, GT Patel in the US, to the UK CEO, Sarah Walker, down to the
Mm.
marketing team that I've been working with in the UK. At every event you go to at Cisco, you feel that sense of connection, whether you are
Wow.
working in the organization, whether you are a partner, whether you are a client,
Mm-hmm.
it goes across every way in which they work, and it
Right.
fundamentally drives the decisions that they're making as well. And they are
Yeah.
actively working towards making this world a better place. And they actually have the scale to be able to do things like that. So I think
Mm.
there are organizations that are balancing the two. Like I say, I think most things aren't about resolving for one or the other, and we're not there to fix one or the other. It's not all just heart or just all performance. I think so much of what we need to learn in the workplace is about managing tensions, two things that seem to be seemingly opposites, but are in fact connected, which are polarities.
Mm.
And learning how to do that, which I think is really about delivering high heart and high performance, is actually an incredible flex right now and something that we need to learn how to do a lot more of. So, for
Yeah.
example, we worked a lot in the last 3 years with a company, a Silicon Valley company called SnapLogic, who are at the forefront of AI integration. Yet they chose a partner called Humanity Works Consultancy and then a chief heart officer to work with them to build stronger teams. And that was a lot of the work that we've done over the last 3 years is working with their sales organization. Now, you would imagine that a sales organization, focusing on culture, that's typically seen as being kind of numbers driven and hard hitting. But their chief sales officer, David Lee, who I recommend people follow, he's an incredibly inspiring leader. His kind of first act, as leader was actually, let's work on building the culture. Let's work on building a one team mentality so that we are all united as a global sales leadership team so that we can create great outcomes. And that work that we did together has resulted in exactly that. They are seeing tremendous success now, and are going from strength to strength. So I think the shift is happening. I'm seeing it through the work that we're doing, obviously, with our clients, in the US, in the UK. I'm going to be flying out to Riyadh and Dubai in the next couple of months because they actually in the UAE have created a happiness council, and they have a chief happiness officer in the government. And they have a goal to actually making Dubai one of the happiest places in the world to work and to live in. And so there's huge investment now in that region. And really, they're working towards helping and supporting organizations to create healthier cultures so that their people can thrive. And that's reflected now in that I'm being flown out to these different regions,
Mm.
in Saudi and in Dubai, over the next couple of months to go and speak to leaders in the region to help them to understand how they can actually do that. What are the frameworks that they need? What are the tools that they need? And making that shift from command and control leadership to actually more trust-based leadership. And so I think the shifts are happening. I think you've
Mm.
probably got to look for them. I think I've got a very privileged seat in that I get to work with very forward-thinking organizations who are really embracing that. And but I fundamentally believe that we are shifting towards this. I agree with Gary Vee, then in the next 10 years, I think that we will see more of a shift to more human-centric workplaces, to having more human connection. And I think actually AI will push us towards doing that more.
Yeah, no, I really hope it does because yeah, I was listening to a podcast with what's his name? Mo Gawat, which
Oh
is
yeah, he's great.
ex-Google. Yeah,
Yeah.
he's really, really great. And he is did I know who he was until I listened to this podcast? Because he was recently on the Diary of a CEO talking to Stephen about AI and the future of that and sort of UBI. And I mean, his sort of prediction is that we will have 12 to 15 years of hell and then utopia
Yeah.
will arrive, basically. That's his assessment. And gosh, who knows? I also listened to this really fascinating podcast with this dude, which I can't remember his name. And he said, he said like this AI revolution that people are predicting is impossible because we just don't have the data centers, nor do we have the chips. So it's a really interesting sort of, yeah, it's like, who do you listen to? Where do you think it's all going to go? Like, it's a really fascinating area because, yeah, who knows where AI is going to take us? And in so many ways, we can't do anything but to embrace it, I think. But how can you embrace it in a human way so it actually makes our lives better and not worse, basically? What are some
Yeah.
of your thoughts on AI?
So I think, I mean, we use AI in our business, for
Yeah.
so much, and no doubt, after we've recorded this podcast, we'll both be using an AI tool to cut clips from it, which
Mm,
we would have spent maybe hours editing beforehand. Now you don't need to.
mm,
So I think the role of AI really, I think it's important for an organization to really think about what is the role of AI in our
mm,
business? What is it that it's there to do? Is it there to take away some of the grunt work? Is it there to speed up kind of the deep research that might have taken a long time to do beforehand? Is it there to replace thinking? Is it there to make things efficient? What is it that it's there to do? And I think at the same time, you need to then think about, okay, well, if that's the role that we want to assign it, how does that
mm,
fit with the values of our business? If we're a people first business, how does that fit with the values? How does that fit with our value of, say, integrity? How does that fit with
mm,
our value of honesty? How does that fit with our value of, maybe a value could be, that we are, we're one or we're strong or whatever those values are. So I think that ethics and values plays a really big part in deciding what role AI plays in the
mm,
organization. I think then you've got another conversation to have is what infrastructure do we have in place that actually can support the use of AI? What is the data protection that we have in place? Because recently there was a group of, I think, research students that were able to extract from a large language model Salesforce's key data, and it
wow.
revealed financial metrics and all kinds of information. And that is really worrying because
Mm,
ultimately, I think we are thinking about AI like it's a computer somewhere else that has
mm,
a life of its own. But AI is created by humans.
mm,
We feed it. AI is getting stronger. My question is, are we getting wiser?
mm,
Are we now putting in information that is very sensitive into a platform that can then share it with other people? Is that wise? Are we
mm,
putting, are we asking AI to do our critical thinking for us? Are we asking AI to make strategic decisions? It's a tool. It
mm,
doesn't really have the full context of the environment or the business you're operating or understand the people that you're working with. And that is really dangerous because those are critical human capabilities that a machine cannot and should not be displacing.
Mm,
And you mentioned at the top that article you and I were discussing from the Financial
mm,
Times, where they talked about in the age that we're in right now, there's two key dangers. One of them is distraction, and the other one is displacement. So distraction is that we're so heavily distracted by our devices that we can't focus on anything for a long enough period of time, that we're not seeing through long-term goals. So we're constantly prioritizing short-term fixes, which is why we've got, for example, at the moment, what I call the resilience paradox, where our lives feel harder, but instead of training ourselves to do the right kind of hard things, we soothe ourselves with comfort. The average American watches 7 hours of screen time outside of work.
mm,
And so we are kind of just distracting ourselves to the point where we don't have to deal with things that we're finding hard. And that's again spilling over into organizations where people aren't having
mm,
courageous conversations. The displacement point that was made in that Financial Times article was actually talking about the fact that we are displacing some of our most critical human capabilities, like strategic thinking, like thinking for ourselves, and using AI tools to do that. And that actually reduces our own human capabilities. So, like I say, AI is getting stronger, but are we as human beings becoming wiser? And so I think we have to really, again, go back to the role that AI plays in the organization. We have to think about the security implications. We need to think about the ethics and the moral side of it and the infrastructure, the data that supports it. Because without all of those things, I think we're heading down then the hell that Mo was referencing, because otherwise it's like the wild, wild west.
mm,
And I think that that will cause more challenges than actually solve for things.
mm. Yeah, I think I concur with all of that. To start bringing things to a close, I want to ask you one final question, which is, Sharon, what is one thing that you are excited about in terms of the future? Like, what is it that, like, yeah, brings you great excitement and sort of makes you want to jump out of bed in the morning?
For work or for personal?
Whatever comes to mind.
Ah, well, I think on a work level, I think it's seeing companies really embrace the collective, um, the I think from a work perspective, it's seeing companies recognize that actually building that stronger collective culture is really key. And I think that really makes me excited. It's seeing leaders reach out. It's not me reaching out to them, but it's them reaching out to me and
Mm,
saying, this is the work that we need to do. And I believe in this and I'm championing it. And this is, this is the direction that we're taking. We want to build stronger teams. We want to build a stronger connected culture. We want to build a more trust-based model. We want to move away from the old way of doing things. That is deeply exciting and is an absolute joy, to work with organizations who want to embrace that and are ready for it. There's nothing better. I think on a personal level for me, as I guess I'm not just the chief heart officer at Humanity Works, I'm also the chief heart officer in my home. And I
mm,
think it's really watching that relationship develop between my son and my daughter and watching them come together and seeing them become a stronger kind of brother sister unit, because I know
mm.
that they will need each other, as they get older. And I'm what society would call an older mum. So I'm that bond, I think, for me, that they have with each other is really important, because I know that they'll draw so much strength from it. And so I
Mm.
think that really makes me excited, and it brings me so much joy and happiness to watch them grow up as individuals, but also grow stronger together. And I love that.
Oh, I love that. That's so sweet. Sharon, thank you so much for coming on to, I'm calling this podcast Field Observations with Tonya, because that's what it is, right? It's field observations. You are observing the field and sharing what's coming up because it's always evolving, like you said earlier, kicking us all the way back to that. quote by Michelle Obama is that we're always becoming, and a part of becoming is observing, learning, adapting, being flexible. And so, yeah, thank you so much for coming on.
Pleasure. Thank you, Tor. This has been such a wonderful conversation, and it's lovely to be back with you again. Thank you.
Thank you.